Making any movie, no matter how it turns out, is like shoving a boulder up a hill. And making a movie that's actually good? Well, that's truly nothing short of a miracle. On paper, it goes without saying that each of the following 10 movies categorically shouldn't have worked. Perhaps they were an ultra-belated sequel coming way too many decades after the fact, a horror remake that controversially deviated from the source material, or a film so bold it struggled to receive a conventional release altogether. For one reason or another, these movies all seemed destined to fail, whether critically, commercially, or even both. But each of these films loudly proved the skeptics wrong, turning in an impressively sturdy end product. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for What Culture, and here are 10 recent movies that never should have worked, but did. Number 10. Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice. The track record of belated comedy sequels speaks for itself, and so why would anyone think a 35 years in the making Beetlejuice follow-up could ever be any good? Plus, given the generally lackluster quality of director Tim Burton's output over the last 15 years, would his heart really be in it so long after the fact? The answer, shockingly, was a resounding yes. For while Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice is certainly a mess in the storytelling department, it succeeds largely on the strength of its charm, its visual creativity, defined largely by practical sets and effects, and the game performances of its ensemble cast, especially a terrific Michael Keaton. Given the tendency for legacy sequels to look back over their shoulder at what came before with a dew-eyed sentimentality, it was enormously refreshing that Beetlejuice 2 forewent this in favour of another wacky, delightfully unhinged comedy horror romp that absolutely lived up to its beloved predecessor. And as if that wasn't a good enough outcome, it even turned a hefty profit at the box office, having easily tripled its budget already. Number 9. Sasquatch Sunset. At first glance, you could be forgiven for assuming that Sasquatch Sunset, a wordless indie fantasy drama about 4 Sasquatches living out their lives in the Californian wilderness, was an SNL skit, because it doesn't seem conceivable that this concept could sustain a feature-length film. But what a delightfully weird surprise this was! A dryly funny and at times mournfully sad movie which makes the most of its cast members' facial expressions and body language. Jesse Eisenberg and especially Riley Keough are excellent as 2 members of the Bigfoot Quartet, and while the offbeat, dialogue-devoid style won't be for all tastes, the fact that it actually sees out its 88-minute runtime while maintaining interest is a phenomenal achievement. Melding gorgeous visual storytelling with incredible makeup effects and subtle but brilliant performances, Sasquatch Sunset takes a concept seemingly tailor-made for a short film and inexplicably makes it work at feature length. Number 8. Speak No Evil. When a remake of 2022's Danish horror hit Speak No Evil was first announced, horror fans the world over groaned at what would inevitably be a watered-down, sanitized take on the deeply provocative and polarizing original. And while that is true to an extent, given that this English-language retelling ditches the original's relentlessly bleak finale for something more viscerally satisfying, the filmmaking and performances are engaging enough that it still works. Yes, this remake predictably tones down the savagery of its inspiration, but James McAvoy's performance as the central antagonist is so enticingly disturbing, even more so than his equivalent role in the original, that it's easy enough to forgive the narrative concessions. Given Hollywood's history of taking acclaimed international horror and turning it into patronizing, low-rent junk, this was a pleasant surprise, especially with it being produced by Schlock Factory Blumhouse. It ain't perfect, but it's a rock-solid companion piece to its nastier predecessor. Number 7. Beverly Hills Cop, Axel F. Much like Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice, the recent 4th Beverly Hills Cop movie had so much working against it. Where to even begin? It took a full 30 years to get this sequel made after numerous botched attempts. The previous film was awful, Eddie Murphy's star has faded considerably over the last 15 years, and it forewent a theatrical release in favour of the Netflix original treatment. I mean, the red flags speak for themselves. And though Beverly Hills Cop Axel F doesn't reach the brilliance of the original 2 films, it is a firmly entertaining and respectable follow-up that serves as a welcome palate cleanser following the awful Beverly Hills Cop 3. Crucially, Murphy is clearly game for the exercise and effortlessly slinks back into the role of Axel Foley, while franchise cast members Judge Reinhold, John Ashton, Paul Reiser, and Bronson Pinchot are given worthwhile supporting roles. Given that a 3 decades later Beverly Hills Cop movie could and probably should have felt like a dated embarrassment, embarrassment, it's truly impressive that this is a surprisingly solid legacy sequel. Number 6. The People's Joker. It's not that a parody of the Joker shot through the lens of a transgender woman should have been an inherent artistic failure, but rather that it's incredible this film was ever actually released at all. The People's Joker, a creation of trans filmmaker Vera Drew, is an unofficial, unendorsed DC Comics parody which reimagines the Clown Prince of Crime's origin story as an expression of gender identity and self-acceptance. Almost immediately after the film was announced to premiere at 2022's Toronto International Film Festival, Drew received irate letters from an unnamed media conglomerate assumed by most to be Warner Brothers Discovery, pressuring her not to go ahead with the screening. The People's Joker nevertheless screened to rave reviews, though Drew pulled further screenings at the festival due to the obvious rights issues, which in turn raised questions about whether Drew's film would ever be available to watch through legitimate channels. Ultimately, it did end up releasing theatrically and on streaming in the middle of 2024, likely due to Warner Brothers' decision to more or less ignore the film. This was surely a calculated decision on their part to avoid invoking the Streisand effect, that is, granting the project more publicity by dragging it through the legal mud. Number 5. Ricky Stenicki. Ricky Stenicki is a throwback to an era of comedy that many contemporary viewers have little interest in revisiting. The high-concept, gross-out comedies of the 1990s and 2000s. Given that Dumb and Dumber director Peter Farrelly hasn't produced a good comedy movie in years, it was near impossible to have faith in this homage to his heyday, which had enormous potential to come off as an embarrassing pining for the more politically incorrect past of Hollywood comedy. But Ricky Stenicki ultimately lands on the right side of charming, largely thanks to an unbelievably committed performance from John Cena as Rod, an actor who is hired to portray the titular fake persona invented by two friends to get them out of trouble. It's an aggressively stuck-in-the-past film, but its deference towards nauseating sight gags and unapologetic stupidity actually proves somewhat refreshing, serving as a peer back towards a dumber, more low-effort, yet still gut-bustingly funny era of comedy. Without Cena's outstanding work, though, it wouldn't hit nearly as hard. Number 4. Saw X. Following two botched attempts to move the Saw franchise away from Tobin Bell's John Kramer, who hilariously died way back in 2006's Saw 3, the decision to set Saw X between the first two Saw films seemed to whiff of pure desperation. For starters, a prequel focusing on Kramer's earlier career as Jigsaw innately has no suspense regarding his survival, and secondly, its intent to make Kramer a more sympathetic figure had massive potential to blow up in the filmmakers' faces. He is, after all, a serial killer. But against tremendous odds, Saw X ended up being the best reviewed of all the Saw films, largely due to its more character-driven storytelling approach, digging deep into Kramer's own fight for survival and righteous quest against the charlatans who scammed him with the promise of a cancer cure. The main reason that Saw X works so well, inevitably, is Tobin Bell's outstanding performance as Kramer, bringing gravitas and even emotional resonance to a character who, despite earning a measure of sympathy, is undeniably still a monster. It doesn't exactly chart a course forward for the franchise without Bell, who, remember, is 82 years old, but Saw X nevertheless offers up a surprisingly neat and tidy addition to the series' wildly convoluted lore. Number 3. Gran Turismo. The prospect of a movie based on the hit Gran Turismo racing game seemed totally ridiculous, and even more so once it was revealed that said film would adapt the real-life story of a teenage Gran Turismo player who became a pro racer for real. It sounds corny as hell, and frankly, the marketing didn't do much to dissuade from this fact. But credit where it's due, director Neil Blomkamp took basic assembly ingredients and delivered a shockingly entertaining underdog sports flick. Yes, it's a glorified 134-minute advert for Sony's hit racing franchise, but the racing scenes are electrifyingly dynamic. Archie Madekwe's protagonist is genuinely likable, and David Harbour gives a far better performance than he needed to as trainer Jack Salter. The story doesn't offer many surprises, but for a movie many expected to be yet another toe-curlingly off-key video game adaptation, this one actually captured the essence of the games better than just about anyone expected. Number 2. The First Omen. It was tough not to roll one's eyes when a prequel to legendary horror film The Omen was first announced, with the film seemingly destined to be yet another lore-expanding exercise in brand reinforcement that basically nobody asked for. Plus, with this being directed director Akasha Stevenson's feature debut, the chances were even higher that it would end up a calamitous misfire. And yet, The First Omen is a credit to unnecessary horror prequels, and how, with an inspired through line, engaging filmmaking, and great performances, they can prove even the most ardent cynics wrong. Though undeniably familiar to a point, The First Omen's story slots neatly into the franchise's existing chronology, while offering up an atmospheric and immersive supernatural horror romp, elevated by both Stevenson's tactile visual filmmaking and a superb lead performance from Servant star Nell Tiger-Free. While it might not change your mind about the prospect of the Omen franchise continuing on in earnest, it is an uncommonly well-made and smartly conceived horror prequel. Number 1. Milk and Cereal. Though it's certainly encouraging to see how the affordability of cinema-caliber digital cameras has empowered low-budget indie filmmakers in recent years, it's also fair to say that the lower barrier for entry makes it much harder for filmmakers to stand out in a crowded field. And so, when director Curry Barker dropped his 62-minute found-footage horror film Milk and Cereal on YouTube back in August, it faced an uphill struggle of discoverability, regardless of both the popularity of Barker's YouTube channel and the quality of the film itself. Produced for just $800, this horror about a duo of YouTube pranksters who torment one another became an immediate viral hit, having been viewed over 800,000 times at the time of press, while receiving rave reviews from many outlets. Though Milk and Cereal likely hasn't been a financial hit for Barker, it has allowed him to nudge open a door to the industry, and it wouldn't be remotely surprising if a traditional studio approached him to produce his next project. For indie filmmakers everywhere, it's downright inspiring.